when it comes to super.
Order. The member's time has expired. In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for members' statement is concluded, and I give the call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I inform the House that the Prime Minister will be absent from question time today and tomorrow as he is in Japan attending the funeral of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. I will answer questions on behalf of the Prime Minister. The member for Barton will also be absent from question time today, and questions relating to the Indigenous Australians portfolio will be answered by the member for Kingston.
Questions without notice. I give the call to the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Acting Prime Minister. Acting Prime Minister, Australians are suffering under your government in relation to rising costs of living pressures at the supermarket, in their electricity bills, in their gas bills, at the Bowser, when they renovate their homes, and certainly in relation to increasing mortgage payments that they have to make under your government. With these increasing pressures on Australian households, will the government rule out tax increases which would further increase cost of living pressures in the upcoming budget?
I give the call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question. Our position on tax, as we took it to the election, is well known, and there are no changes to that position since the election. It's ironic, though, that we get this question from the opposition, because one of the great myths of Australian politics is that the Liberals will always tax less, when in fact the truth of the matter is that the highest taxing government in Australia's history is the Howard government, and the second highest taxing government in Australia's history is the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison government. Those opposite are the ones who go for higher taxes. In fact, when you think about it, over the last 10 years, if you were a Menzian Liberal and you imagined that you were going to support a party which was about low taxes and small government and small spending, and you looked at this lot, it says everything about why Kooyong is no longer in their pile. Now, we are absolutely committed to—
Order. I'll just ask the Deputy Prime Minister, Acting Prime Minister to resume his seat. Order. Members on my right. The Leader will be heard in silence. I give the call to the Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr Speaker, it's on relevance. The Acting Prime Minister is saying nothing to the hurting households across the country in this arrogant contribution that he's making, which is based on fiction, not fact.
The Leader will resume his seat. The Order. The Leader of the House.
Just a point of order. You've previously made rulings about the Leader of the Opposition misusing points of order in that way. He raised a point of order at the beginning and then went on to just a general rant, which should not be allowed.
I call the Acting Prime Minister to remain relevant to the question. He is talking about taxation rates, and I asked him to return to the question.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And we do understand the pressure that many households are facing with their budgets, with increasing interest rates, and easing the pressure on the cost of living is one of the first priorities of this government. It's why we've increased the minimum wage. It's why this week we have 2 bills in the parliament which are about making medicines cheaper, childcare more affordable. But let me make this point. In terms of the pressures that people are facing in managing their household budgets, a critical pressure is in relation to energy prices, and that is in no small part due to a lost decade of economic reform when it comes to dealing with the question of energy, where they had 22 different energy policies and failed to land one of them. Now, dealing with the cost of living is core business for this government. Our position on tax is very clear. It hasn't changed, but what Australians know is that in this government, they have a government which is going to fight for their household budget.
Give a call to the member for Corangamite.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Acting Prime Minister. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to ease the cost of living for Australian families? And is the Acting Prime Minister aware of any alternative policies?
Give the call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank the member for Corangamite for her question, and She and I are partners in this place in representing the great city of Geelong, which, as of about 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, I can reliably inform the House is literally the happiest place on earth. Mr Speaker, our government is committed to investments in skills, in technology, in education, which is about trying to build a high-value, high-productivity, high-wage economy. But the issue which is front of mind for every Australian right now is the question of the cost of living. And as I said, we understand the pressures that people feel with rising interest rates on their household budgets. And it's why easing that pressure is the #1 priority of this government. Almost the first act of this government was to seek a real wage increase for the lowest paid. Last week, we saw the biggest increase in the pension in more than a decade. And this week, we are dealing with 2 pieces of legislation which continue this week.
Member for Hume.
The National Health Amendment, General Co-payment
Member for Barker.
will see
cease interjecting.
We'll see a reduction in the maximum co-payment for medicines to $30, which will make medicines cheaper. And the Family Assistance Legislation Amendment, Cheaper Childcare Bill, will, for 96% of users, make childcare less expensive. But I'm asked whether there are any other alternatives, a question of which those opposite used to be particularly fond. And yesterday, the Shadow Finance Minister gave a particularly succinct answer to that question. We're in opposition, she said, we don't have policies. Can you believe that? Although, given the last 10 years, it's surprising that the Liberal Party feel they need to qualify that statement with the word opposition, because in government they had no policies on skills, no policies on productivity, no policies on wages. They did, to be fair, have a whole lot of policies on energy. It's just that they didn't have any that they could agree on. But it does have to be said that in the statement from the Shadow Minister for Finance, there was, compared to the last 3 years, a very commendable and refreshing outbreak of honesty. Mr Speaker, after 10 long years, government under Labor is back in the business of economic management. And under the leadership of the Treasurer and the Finance Minister, we will be putting a budget to this House in about a month, which is going to build a much stronger economy for every Australian.
Order. Order. I give the call to the member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Last week, in an interview on Sky News, the Minister for Finance refused to rule out changes to franking credits, changes to negative gearing, and refused to rule out scrapping Stage 3 tax cuts. Will the Treasurer rule out changes to franking credits, negative gearing and Stage 3 tax cuts?
I give the call to the Treasurer.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. Every time the member for Hume opens his mouth, he reminds us why, in the 15 seasons of Sean McAuliffe's Mad as Hell, there has never been a funny character than when the member for Hume played himself on Wednesday night. And you can see why Sean McAuliffe tapped the mat after 15 seasons. You cannot top the comedic performance of the member for Hume being interviewed by Laura Jays. The very idea, as the acting Prime Minister said before, that these characters opposite would have the nerve to ask us about tax and about the cost of living after the wasted decade that they have just presided over. We've made our position on tax very clear, and what we have said is our priority when it comes to tax reform is multinational taxes. And we took to the election, and we will implement in the October budget, a plan to ensure that multinationals pay a fairer share of the tax where they make their profits, so that we can fund the services that we desperately need to fund. And so that's our position, Mr Speaker, as you know. And again, as the acting Prime Minister rightly pointed out, you'd think that the dregs of the former government would know better than to come up to this dispatch box, having spent a decade taxing more, borrowing more, spending more, but delivering much, much less than its Labor predecessors, to actually have the nerve to come up here and ask us about tax and the cost of living. Now, as the Acting Prime Minister mentioned a moment ago,
members on my
those
left.
opposite have absolutely no idea, they have absolutely no credibility, and as the Shadow Minister for Finance said, they have absolutely no alternatives to the proposals that we will fund in the budget in October.
Is the Treasurer concluded his answer?
No.
I just ask him to resume his seat, and I ask the Leader of the Opposition to state the point of order.
Well, on relevance is the point of order, Mr Speaker. The question was, will the Treasurer rule out changes to franking credits, superannuation, negative gearing and stage 3 tax cuts? And he's gone no way to answering that question.
You resume your seat. The Treasurer is in order, and I have order. The member for Moncrieff. The Treasurer is in order. He is referring to tax policy, and I asked him to return to the balance of the question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And I've made the government's priorities clear when it comes to tax reform, and that is multinational taxes. And as people would have read in the Fin today, there is a measure before the House, which was a measure on franking credits proposed by the former Treasurer, a fellow called Scott Morrison, in 2016. So there's a proposal before the Parliament to finish that job that he announced in the MyEFO of 2016. Now, Mr Speaker, as the Shadow Minister for Finance has said, those opposite have absolutely no alternatives to what we're proposing in the budget. The member for Hume is already a laughingstock in this place. The Shadow Minister for Finance is determined to outdo him. The Leader of the Nationals is no better, talking about the little present that they left the Australian people when the government changed hands. The present that those opposite left the Australian people when government changed hands was skyrocketing inflation, falling real wages, $1 trillion in debt, which is becoming more and more costly for the Australian people to service.
Give the call to the member for Gilmore.
My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs and Cyber Security. What action is the Australian government taking as a result of the Optus data breach?
Give the call to the Minister for Home Affairs and Minister for Cyber Security.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do want to thank the member for Gilmore for this very important question. Speaker, on Wednesday the 21st of September, the Australian government was advised of a significant cybersecurity breach from Optus. Optus have advised that this breach has revealed some personal data of 9.8 million Australians. Of those 2.8 million Australians, significant amounts of personal data has been taken. Responsibility for this security breach rests with Optus, and I want to note that the breach is of a nature that we should not expect to see in a large telecommunications provider in this country. Very substantial support has been provided by the Australian government, and I want to credit the work of the Australian Signals Directorate, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre and the Australian Federal Police in that support. For the Australian government more broadly, our focus now is doing whatever we can to help protect Australians who are affected by this breach. This is a very large multi-agency effort which has seen many hundreds of public servants work through recent public holidays, through the night and straight through the weekends, and the Albanese government thanks them for their efforts. The Australian government, the ACCC and APRA are engaging with the banking sector to see what additional steps can be taken to protect customers. This is complex, it's legally and technically complex, but we are working on a solution. We will also be providing additional protections on government platforms such as MyGov. We expect Optus to continue to do everything that they can to support their customers and former customers. One way that they can do this is providing free credit monitoring to impacted customers. This will help protect those customers against identity theft, and I call on Optus to make that commitment today. Put yourself in the shoes of an Optus customer. You might be one of the member for Gilmore's constituents living in Bateman Bay or Nowra. You might be a pensioner whose information has been stolen. This is a time of intense anxiety, and I say to Optus, you can do something about this problem today, and we ask you to do that. A very substantial reform task is going to emerge from a breach of this scale and size, and there's a number of policy issues that I think the public will soon become quite aware of. One significant question is whether the cybersecurity requirements that we place on large telecommunications providers in this country are fit for purpose. I also note that in other jurisdictions, a data breach of this size would result in fines amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars. I really hope that this reform task is something that we can work on collaboratively across the parliament, and I'll speak in coming days about how we will work through those issues in conjunction with other members of parliament. Thank you.
Give the call to the honourable member for Goldstein. Order. Just wait for the microphone. Just pause a moment. Just wait for the microphone to be working. I'll give the call to the member for Goldstein.
To the Attorney-General. There are reports that the government has cut a deal with the opposition to weaken National Corruption Commission legislation to get it passed. Can you reassure the public, many of whom voted for integrity, that should third parties, including unions, business and lobbyists, seek to corrupt government, that they could be investigated, and that the Commission could investigate serious pork barrelling, as Labor proposed during the election campaign?
I'll give the call to the Attorney-General.
I thank the member for Goldstein for her question, and I thank her for her constructive engagement throughout my extensive consultation on the National Anti-Corruption Commission. This is a major piece of reform to Australia's integrity framework, and I've consulted across the parliament, including the opposition and the crossbench in both houses, on the formation of the legislation. And I look forward to introducing legislation for a National Anti-Corruption Commission this week. The Australian people believe in integrity. The Australian people voted for a government which will deliver a powerful, transparent and independent National Anti-Corruption Commission. The Commission will have jurisdiction to investigate serious or systemic corruption and will form a central pillar in the integrity framework of our country. It will help restore trust and enforce standards of integrity and accountability in our federal government system. The government publicly released design principles based on the advice of experts that will ensure the Commission operates effectively. The legislation will reflect the principles set out in our design principles.
Leader of the Opposition.
In relation to third parties, the Commission will have broad powers to investigate allegations of serious or systemic corruption of or by a public official. The Commission will be able to investigate a corruption issue that could involve serious or systemic conduct by any person that could adversely affect the honesty or impartiality of a public official's conduct. In relation to pork barrelling, decisions about the allocation of public funds should be made, of course, in the public interest. The government will not be instructing the Commission on what particular matters it can and cannot investigate. It will be up to the Commission to decide what matters it investigates. To be clear, if the Commission considers that the administration of a particular discretionary grants program gives rise to a serious or systemic corruption issue, then the Commissioner will have the ability to investigate that issue. I hope all members of this parliament can recognise the importance of this significant reform and support the bill.
Give a call to the member for Swan.
My question is to the Treasurer. What are some of the pressures currently facing the budget, and what are some of the options to help Australians deal with the cost of living?
Give a call to the Treasurer.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and especially to the member for Swan for her question about the budget and the cost of living. When the parliament next sits after this week, it will be to hand down the October budget. And what we've tried to do is to level with Australians about the serious challenges facing the economy, global and domestic, and the substantial pressures which are hitting the budget as a consequence of that. And one of the biggest pressures on the budget is the interest costs on the $1 trillion of debt that we inherited from those opposite when they were in office. Now, with higher interest rates, the debt that will now cost the budget, that debt will now cost the budget more and more to service over the years. Now, to give the House a sense of what we're looking at, the interest bill on the pre-election projections for government debt will be around $16 billion higher over the forward estimates and $125 billion higher over the next decade from higher bond yields alone. And what that means is, to give honourable members an example, The interest bill in 2025-26 is expected to now be about $34 billion. The interest bill in 2032 of about $65 billion. Now, we'll update those figures in the usual way in our October budget, in line with the revised budget and economic forecast, to update all of the conditions that exist at budget time. But it does underscore the pressure from this bid, that the pressure on the budget from this interest bill on the $1 trillion of debt that those opposite racked up will only intensify over time. And that's on top of the areas we need to fund that were either due to expire under the previous government, weren't budgeted for, or weren't delivered on time. For example, the additional $1.4 billion to continue our COVID-19 response that the Health Minister announced last week. More than $3.5 billion that hasn't been spent for road and rail projects that have been delayed in my colleague's portfolio here, and what will likely amount to around $2 billion or more in support for flood-affected communities. Now, just as there's pressure on the Commonwealth budget, of course there is pressure on Australians as well, from the skyrocketing cost of living and falling real wages and rising interest rates as well. And that's why, within the budget constraints that I've just run through for the benefit of the House, the task of the budget will be to provide responsible cost of living relief that has an economic dividend. And that's why cheaper childcare is so important with an economic dividend. Cheaper TAFE fees, cheaper medicines, getting wages moving again, beginning with the lowest paid Australians. That's why this is so important. Now, I think Australians understand that the new government is doing what they can to responsibly provide cost of living relief to Australians. They know that the mess that those left us can't be fixed in one budget alone.
Time has expired. I give the call. When members on my left cease interjecting, I give the call to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Acting Prime Minister, and I refer to the government's decision to scrap the cashless debit card, which the Alice Springs Mayor has said will increase domestic violence. Kununurra local Kenneth Green called the card a lifesaver, and Wongatha Elder Janice Scott said the biggest difference with the card was for the kids. Suddenly they had food, they had clothing. Given the warnings from local Indigenous communities, can the Acting Prime Minister guarantee there will be no increase in domestic violence or neglect of children as a result of scrapping the cashless debit card?
I give the call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the member for her question and acknowledge that Indigenous communities around this country have had to endure a sad history of broken promises and failed programs when it comes to making real difference in areas like domestic violence, areas like housing, areas like keeping children in schools. But in seeking to help Indigenous communities in this country, we don't do that by stripping them of their dignity. And that's why the cashless debit card, which seeks to do exactly that, that's why at the last election we promised to scrap it, and we will. Because what it did was to strip people of their dignity. What we need to be doing is working with Indigenous communities to empower them.
For New England.
What we need to be doing is working with Indigenous communities to empower them, which is why we've announced over the course of the weekend $50 million to provide additional drug and alcohol services in cashless debit card sites, why we've committed $16 million towards community-led economic development services in CDC sites, because all of these are measures which are about working with Indigenous communities to empower them. Now, since the election, both the Minister for Social Services and the Minister for Indigenous Australians have been visiting Indigenous communities across the breadth of this country to work with them about the ways in which we can deal with the critical issues which are affecting their communities. The cashless debit card did none of that, but they can be assured that in this government they will have a partner to improve their lives.
The member for Page will cease interjecting. Give the call to the member for Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to change policy to make medicines more affordable and list life-changing medicines on the PBS?
The call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank my South Australian colleague, the member for Adelaide, for that question. Because at this year's election, Mr Speaker, Labor promised to strengthen Medicare and to cut the cost of medicines, and we're getting on with delivering those promises. Mr Speaker, cutting the cost of Medicare is not only good for households who are dealing with unprecedented cost of living pressures, it's also good for the health of the nation, because we know from the Bureau of Statistics that every year as many as 900,000 Australians go without medicines that their doctors have said is important for their health simply because they can't afford it. Now, this week, legislation will be debated in this House to deliver the biggest cut to the cost of medicines in the 75-year history of the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, cutting the general patient maximum co-contribution from $42.50 to just $30. And support for that legislation across the parliament will help us deliver that cut on the 1st of January, as we promised. But, Mr Speaker, I'm also pleased to report that Australians will see additional price relief for medicines even sooner than that. This Saturday, on the 1st of October, the government will deliver reductions in the prices of more than 2,000 different brands of medicines, delivering $130 million in price relief into the pockets of ordinary Australians and $930 million back to the budget that can be invested in new, innovative, state-of-the-art medicines. For example, Mr Speaker, 500,000 Australians use esomeprazole for the treatment of stomach ulcers, and after this Saturday, each script for those 500,000 Australians will be about $7 cheaper. About 60,000 Australians use quetiapine for the treatment of bipolar and similar disorders, and each script for that drug will be about $6 per script cheaper next week than it was this week. On Saturday, Mr Speaker, we'll also deliver 6 new and amended listings to the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. The well-known immunotherapy, Keytruda, will be extended to head and neck cancers. About 500 patients will now have access to that life-changing, life-saving medicine that otherwise would cost $135,000 per course of treatment. After this listing, it will go down to $42.50 per script, and from the 1st of January, Mr Speaker, to just $30. Azelimab will be extended to the treatment of bladder cancers for 400 patients every year who would be paying about $106,000 for each course of treatment. Mr Speaker, the Albanese government's plans for cheaper medicines will not just deliver much-needed cost of living relief at this time of unprecedented pressure, it will also mean that no one in this country need go without medicines because they can't afford it.
The call to the member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Acting Prime Minister. Due to record energy prices, businesses in my electorate of Mallee are considering closing, potentially leaving hundreds unemployed. One such business, a brick manufacturer in Stawell, announced it was closing after over 80 years in business. When will businesses in my electorate receive the promised $275 energy bill relief?
The call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for her question. And we certainly acknowledge the pressure that is being placed on household budgets, but in this case on businesses, associated with increases of prices. And as I've said earlier, core business, the #1 priority for this government, is about easing the cost of living. And that also goes to the question of reducing energy prices. I mean, one of the real differences now, compared to when I first entered Parliament in 2007, is that cheap energy in this country is renewable energy, and that the way in which we get energy prices down is improving our energy grid and having policy certainty which allows people to invest in renewable energy and have that renewable energy be able to be received by the grid. But the problem is that we've had a lost decade when it comes to energy policy. Those opposite had 22 different energy policies, failed to be able to have a situation where there was policy certainty, and that's why we did not see the investment in renewable energy that we should. On this side of the House, we have done more in the last 15 weeks of this government than those opposite did in the last 10 years. Their inaction on energy has been absolutely shameful. But the height of that shame was what we saw from the former Treasurer, from the Shadow Treasurer, the former Minister for Energy, when he sought to change the law in order to mean that he did not have to tell the Australian people about
acting Prime Minister will take a break, and I will hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Well, Mr Speaker, we have a precedent on the question of relevance that was established by Speaker Jenkins on the importance of ministers having to be directly relevant, and I think it would assist the House if this convention were upheld. And I ask you to ask the Acting Prime Minister to bring his answer back to being directly relevant to a very specific question.
The Acting Prime Minister is in order, and I give him the call now.
The height of the shame of the former government was when the former Energy Minister sought to change the law so that he didn't have to tell the Australian people about an increase in the default retail price for electricity before the election. Can you imagine a more venal, a more pathetic conversation than the former minister must have had with his department when he sought advice about what he needed to do in order to make sure that he didn't have to tell the Australian people about his failure and the failure of his government. And the shame in that is the very reason why now we have the energy issues that we face. But what you've got on this side of the parliament is a government.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition, a point of relevance has already been made. I give you the call.
A point of... I seek leave to table a document, Mr Speaker. Labor's Powering Australia document, which refers to the $275
the Deputy Leader
energy
will
price
resume
cut.
her seat. It's not the time to do that, but if you wish to table a document, wait till the Acting Prime Minister has concluded his answer. The member for Barker. When the House comes to order, I'll call the Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In contrast to the complete ineptitude of those opposite, what we now have is a government which is actually going to have settled policy on energy, which will see a reduction in energy prices.
Members on my left, is the Deputy Leader seeking to table a document?
Labor's Powering Australia policy, which explains the
wait, just a moment, Deputy Leader. I give the call to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
I seek leave to table a document, Mr Speaker.
Is leave. I can't read. I can't read. Deputy Leader. I can't. I don't know what the document is, and the government doesn't know what the document is simply by holding it up. Are you seeking to table document? If so, can you explain to the House the document? I call the Deputy Leader.
Engaged in a dialogue with me, Mr Speaker. The document is the Powering Australia policy. Labor's plan to cut power bills by $275, explained at least 15 times in this document.
Thank you. Thank you. The Manager of Opposition Business.
We're not going to grant leave to tabling the internet.
Right.
Not the internet.
All right. Next question, and we will move to the member. Order. We'll move to the member for Bennelong.
My question is to the Minister for Education. How is the Albanese Labor government changing policy to make childcare more affordable for Australian families?
The call to the Minister for Education.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Bennelong for his question and wish him well in his first speech in just about half an hour's time. Anyone that has children in childcare knows how expensive it is. It's gone up by 41% just in the last 8 years. One of the most important commitments that we made at the election was to cut the cost of childcare. And this week I'll introduce legislation to implement that commitment. it'll cut the cost of childcare for more than 1 million Australian families.
Yeah.
And that's good for children, it's good for parents, and it's good for our economy. For our children, it'll mean they're better prepared for school. For parents, for mums in particular, it'll make it easier to do more paid work if they want to. A lot of Australians want to work more, but if they do, a lot of that pay is gobbled up in childcare costs. So it means that it's not worth it. And this helps explain why 60% of mums with children under the age of 6 are working part-time rather than full-time. If you make childcare cheaper, that helps parents who want to work more hours and more days. And for our economy, that means thousands more skilled workers. Treasury estimates that this will add up to 37,000 extra full-time workers to the economy in 2023-24. Mr Speaker, during the election, we also promised to get the ACCC to conduct an inquiry into childcare costs. And last week, the Treasurer and I announced that this inquiry will start on the 1st of January. The ACCC will provide its interim findings before the 1st of July next year, and it will deliver its final report by the end of next year. And Mr Speaker, just finally, the legislation that I'll introduce this week will also include another important measure. Last year, for the first time ever, the Closing the Gap target for school readiness for Indigenous children went backwards. The gap is getting bigger, not smaller. We've got to turn this around. We all know how important access to early childhood education is in making sure that our children are ready for school. And that's why, as part of the legislation that I will introduce this week, all Indigenous children will be able to access 36 hours of subsidised childcare a fortnight. Mr Speaker, these are important reforms. They're good for children, they're good for parents, and they're good for our economy.
I give the call to the member for Dawson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Northern Australia. I refer to the government's changes to insert its emissions reduction target into the program criteria for projects in Northern Australia infrastructure facility pipeline. Has the minister received any advice from her department that this will lead to gas supply or coal projects in the Northern Australia infrastructure facility pipeline being cancelled, restricted or delayed?
I give the call to the Minister for Resources and Northern Australia.
Thank you to the Leader of the Nats for that unhelpful comment. I do thank the member for their question. And what has happened with the recent legislation in this country is it is aligning all parts of government behind a united aim to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and reduce our targets to 43%. This is something the Australian people voted for. Right across Northern Australia, right across Western Australia, right across Queensland, Victoria, all states in this nation voted for a net zero position. That is a fact, and that is what we are doing. We are making sure that all policy areas align with this government's very ambitious direction to get to net zero emissions by 2050, and that aligns with the rest of the world. And that is something we must be enormously proud of, and only this government will deliver. Those opposite put their head in the sand for the last 10 years and have brought us back down behind everyone else in the climate fight that we need to be able to resist global warming in this country and around the world. We will work with our international partners. We know our international partners, such as Japan and Korea, who we do sell gas to and have been selling gas to for a long time. They will rely on gas as part of their net zero emissions goals. So we will keep providing gas supply, and we will have supply in this country into the future. What those opposite need to know is that the climate change bill has aligned this country with the rest of the world, and I'm very proud of that, and I'm very proud that Northern Australia will be doing it as well. In fact, the only interference that has been made in the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund was from those opposite when they banned a wind farm that would have created hundreds of jobs in Cairns. So So you can talk about that all you like, but you are the ones, sorry, Speaker, those opposite are the ones that have interfered in the NAIF consistently and always. We are the ones who will support Northern Australia and gas into the future.
Order. I give the call to the member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Housing. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to improve the housing affordability challenges confronting Australia?
Great question. Give the call to the Minister for Small Business, Housing and Homelessness.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Hunter. I know that he's very engaged in making sure that more of his constituents have a safe and affordable place to call home. Because, of course, those of us on this side of the House, and I'm sure some on the other side, Mr Speaker, understand that safe and affordable housing is central to the security and dignity of all Australians. Also aware, of course, that rising interest rates and costs and supply issues have impacted on housing affordability right across the country. Indeed, far too many Australians are being hit by increasing rents. Far too many Australians are struggling to afford to be able to buy a home. And sadly, far too many Australians are at risk of experiencing homelessness or are experiencing homelessness. Indeed, we know that there's no quick solutions, but that's why our government has hit the ground running to deliver on our ambitious housing reform agenda with immediate action alongside our medium and long-term goals. Indeed, we've acted very quickly by widening the remit of the National Housing Infrastructure Facility to allow it to invest in social and affordable housing by unlocking up to $575 million. This support will build on our commitment to build 30,000 new social and affordable housing properties through a $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund. Indeed, Mr Speaker, we've had 2 meetings of state and territory housing ministers, and that first meeting was our first in almost 5 years because, of course, those on the other side deemed this not necessary. And our second meeting was at the end of the last sitting week. We've also brought forward, Mr Speaker, the regional first home buyer guarantee to this weekend. So from 1 October, eligible Australians in regional areas will be assisted into home ownership sooner. By helping regional Australians get into their first home with a deposit as little as 5%, Mr Speaker, our commitment will help cut down one of the biggest burdens potential home buyers face and will bring the great Australian dream back into the reach of many. ANZ CoreLogic is saying that the average home buyer in regional Australia now has to save for over 11 years for a deposit to get into the current housing market. We need to make it easier for those people who want to be able to live and work in our regions. And we know, of course, that more Australians are also having trouble with rent because they've been able to buy their own home, and that these measures will help ease pressures for those trying to find a home in the tight rental market. We're also, of course, going to introduce our National Supply and Affordability Council to ensure that the Commonwealth plays a leadership role in increasing housing supply and improving affordability. We've hit the ground running, as I've said. We want to bring new national leadership to housing. We want to get more homes on the ground sooner for more Australians to have a safe and affordable place to call home. And of course, given over the weekend the opposition over there confirmed that they don't have any policies, I look forward to their support for delivering on our ambitious agenda so that more Australians have a safe place to call home.
Order. I give the call to the member for Wentworth.
Thank you. My question is to the Attorney-General, the member for Isaacs. The Labor Party went to the election with a commitment to legislating the National Anti-Corruption Commission. One of the design principles in this policy was that the NACC would have the power to hold public hearings. Could the Attorney please explain why public hearings are essential requirements for an integrity commission and rule out any deals which remove that power?
I give the call to the Attorney-General.
I thank the member for Wentworth for her question.
Members on my right and left.
I thank the member for Wentworth for her question and thank her for the constructive engagement that she has shown with me during the extensive consultation that I have had with the whole of the parliament, including the opposition, crossbench in both houses, on the formation of this legislation. And I do look forward to introducing the legislation for a National Anti-Corruption Commission this week. And I'll say again, the Australian people believe in integrity. The Australian people voted for a government which will deliver a powerful, transparent and independent National Anti-Corruption Commission. It's a commission which will have jurisdiction to investigate serious or systemic corruption and will deliver a central pillar of the integrity framework in this country. It'll help restore trust and enforce standards of integrity and accountability in our federal government system. Some 3 years ago, Labor released design principles based on the advice of experts which will ensure that the Commission operates effectively. The legislation which we are bringing to the Parliament will reflect these principles. And going to the specific matter that was raised by the member for Wentworth, that went to the holding of public hearings. One of the deficiencies of the model that was put forward by the former government, who of course never brought legislation to the Parliament, one of the deficiencies was that public hearings would not be available in respect of allegations made against ministers or allegations made against members of Parliament. As I said repeatedly during public debate about the model that the former government had put forward, that was wrong. And we have made clear in our design principles that not only that public hearings must be available to this commission, because that's something that the experience of the 8 existing state and territory commissions has shown us. In order for an anti-corruption commission such as we are proposing to be fully effective, there must be the possibility of public hearings, and that's what the Parliament will see in the legislation that we bring to the Parliament later this week.
Leader of the Opposition. I give the call to the member for Jagga Jagga.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. What policies are being adopted by the Albanese Labor government to future-proof our energy network and put downward pressure on energy costs? What will this mean for Australian consumers, and why is action so important?
Order. I give the call. To the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for her question and recognise her leadership on matters of climate change. And, Mr Speaker, of course, this is the first question time that has been held since the government's Climate Change Act passed both houses of parliament and received royal assent. And, of course, the important thing about the Climate Change Act is that it sends the message to investors around the world that Australia is open for business in relation to renewable energy, transmission and storage. And I'm pleased to report to the House that that message has been received around the world, including last week, Mr Speaker, in the United States. I received indications from companies like J&J and Amazon and Google that they are considering major investments in renewable energy in this country, up to $2.9 billion worth of job-creating investments in this country. Now, Mr Speaker, this is the importance of certainty in policy frameworks. This is the importance of one set of rules. And part of our approach to the certainty framework is our engagement in international agreements. Now, Mr Speaker, I heard it said yesterday the opposition doesn't have any policies, which I thought was very unfair. Very unfair to the opposition. Because in some ways they're an ideas factory over there, Mr Speaker. They're an ideas factory. We had one last week from the member for Hinkler. The member for Hinkler last week, who had a great idea of leaving the Paris Agreement, Mr Speaker. This was his suggestion for the opposition. Now, Mr Speaker, the opposition would take us into an elite group famous for their investment certainty, their economic robustness of the regime. This elite group that the opposition wants to take us into consists of Libya, Eritrea, Iran and Yemen. They're the countries who aren't in the Paris Agreement. There's only 4. There'd be a 5th. There'd be a 5th now. We'd join that great group of countries with that great investment certainty and that regime. You see, Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, we understand that the cheapest form of energy is renewable energy. The CSIRO knows it. AEMO knows it, who said renewable energy is the cheapest form of energy by a country mile, says AEMO. But the opposition says, no, we know better. We know better. The Paris Agreement is good enough for Russia and Saudi Arabia. It's good enough for North Korea, Mr Speaker, but it's not good enough, apparently, for the Leader of the Opposition.
Give the call to the member for order. The member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Cybersecurity. Has the minister spoken personally to the Optus CEO on the company providing customers with credit monitoring or the other measures she spoke about in her answer?
Give the call to the Minister for Home Affairs and Minister for Cybersecurity.
Thank you, Speaker. The answer is yes.
Give the call. Order. I give the call to the member for Spence.
My question is to the Minister for Skills and Training. What policy changes are the Albanese Labor government making to tackle labour shortages and provide opportunities for Australians, including through Jobs and Skills Australia?
Give the call to the Minister for Skills and Training.
Well, thank you very much, Speaker. Can I thank the member for Spence for his question and, of course, his long advocacy for training in the transport sector, representing workers in that field. Today, this chamber, passed the Jobs and Skills Australia bill. It's a very important bill. It wasn't coincidental that the Prime Minister, this government, sought to have that bill be the first introduced into the parliament this parliamentary term. It's because we know how important it is for us to find the right vehicle to advise government, indeed advise industry, to supply the skills that are in demand now, but also to forecast more precisely the areas of emerging demand. And we believe that JSA will provide that vehicle, and that's really important. I also want to thank, while I'm on my feet responding to the question by from the member for Spence, I'd like to thank the members for Indi, Kennedy and Goldstein. They engaged with me and my office about the bill, and in fact we moved an amendment today reflecting those discussions, which was passed on the voices in this chamber. I did engage with the opposition, we did engage with the crossbench, and we do so because we're a government that want to actually engage with the parliament and get things right. When we said we wanted to create a body, we wanted to do so but have a proper level of engagement in this chamber and the other place. And that's what we're doing, implementing the policies we promised before the last election, doing so in a considered fashion. So if a member in this chamber has a good proposition to a bill that I've introduced, I'm very happy to engage with that member. And that's what's happened here today, improving a bill to ensure that we emphasise the need not only to identify skill shortages in our economy, but also think of the ways we can prevent those that are impeded from access to the labour market, whether they be First Nations people, whether they be people with disability, those people over 55 that have often been discriminated against in this country. And of course, in particular, can I say, we need to do better to provide opportunities for women to access the labour market or provided more opportunities within the labour market, and JSA can provide a role in assisting government and industry to do that as well. This is an important bill. We want this bill to be discussed and debated in the other place. We'd like to see it enacted soon because we inherited a very significant acute skill shortage in this nation. We need to supply the skills the employers are crying out for, that workers need for secure employment, and for our economy, which of course will benefit from a skilled and knowledgeable workforce. That will make it a more productive economy and indeed a more successful country.
Give the call to the member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Acting Prime Minister on Labor's Stage 3 tax cuts. Acting Prime Minister, can you explain the economic benefit of giving a federal politician or anyone else earning more than $200,000 a year an extra $9,000 a year off on their tax, while someone on the minimum wage gets nothing?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question as well. As the honourable member knows and appreciates, I'm sure, the government's position on Stage 3 tax cuts haven't changed for all of the reasons that we've talked about all of the other times that we've been asked in this place and elsewhere. I know that the Leader of the Greens put out a press release in the last 24 hours ago saying that were we to go down the path that the Greens are proposing, then there would be an opportunity to provide more funds in important areas like childcare and healthcare. And I'm very pleased to inform the Greens and the Parliament as well that there will be in the budget in October game-changing investments in healthcare and in childcare. And we are especially proud of the fact that the biggest on-budget new investment in the budget that I hand down from this dispatch box next month will be that game-changing investment in childcare, because cheaper childcare is cost of living relief with an economic dividend. And Australian parents deserve to have that option that the Minister was talking about before and that other colleagues have talked about on other occasions, to work more and earn more if they want to. And we want the childcare system to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem in that regard. So there will be game-changing investments in childcare. There will be the investments in healthcare that the Health Minister ran through before. They will be important elements of the budget, but our position on the tax cuts that the member asked me about hasn't changed.
Call to the member for Macnamara.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Environment and Water. How is the Albanese Labor government showing leadership on the environment, both nationally and internationally, after a decade of neglect?
Give the call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Thank you, and I want to thank the member for Macnamara for that question. He is one of the strongest advocates in this place for real action on climate change and for real action to protect our beautiful environment. I was delighted this week, Mr Speaker, when our Prime Minister signed the Leaders' Pledge for Nature at the United Nations. This was an important commitment joining Australia to the global effort to reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. This is a document that commits us as a nation to working with other nations on stronger global effort to reduce deforestation, stopping unsustainable fishing practices, providing more sustainable food systems, promoting the circular economy and recycling. Not so controversial really, but those opposite refused the opportunity to sign up in 2020 because the Morrison government said, in a moment of real honesty, that this didn't fit. It was inconsistent with their policies. So they rejected the offer made by those dangerous greenies like Angela Merkel and Boris Johnson and Emmanuel Macron and Jacinda Ardern and Justin Trudeau, who invited us to be part of this international effort. And I tell you, they were right that this was inconsistent with their policies, because their policies over the last 9 years saw them cut environment funding by 40%, saw them axe climate laws, saw them sabotage the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, tying it up with brown tape. Those opposite failed to fix Australia's broken environmental laws. They hid the State of the Environment report, had it for months and never released it when they were in government, because it tells the story that Australia's environment is bad and getting worse.
Will just pause, and I'll call the Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, on previous occasions you have directed the Minister back to the question following a preamble. We had about 15 seconds on the question, and then it's been a general spray at the opposition's record. So I ask you follow your own precedent and direct the Minister back to the question.
I thank the Manager. The question was specific about a decade of neglect. The Minister is in order. She is referring to the past decade, and I call the Minister.
I won't talk about the fact they set recycling targets with no way of achieving them. I won't talk about the fact that they halved the areas of Marine Park under high conservation. Instead, I will talk about our priorities, which is legislating more ambitious emissions reduction targets, rewriting our environmental laws to build trust, integrity and efficiency into the system, growing the national estate so that 30% of our land and 30% of our seas will be protected by 2030, protecting our Great Barrier Reef with a $1.2 billion investment, delivering on the promises made and broken on Kakadu National Park by those opposite, establishing a world-leading nature market, investing to better protect threatened species. Australians are so dismayed that our koalas are now endangered along the eastern seaboard. doubling the number of Indigenous rangers, adding to Indigenous protected areas. It is only ever under Labor that the environment is protected.
Time has expired. Order. I give the call to the Manager of Opposition Business.
My question is to the Attorney-General. I refer to the fact that the largest shareholder in Omni Bridgeway, Australia's largest litigation funding business, is Green Cape Capital Pty Limited, the manager of the Green Cape Broadcap Fund, a fund in which the Attorney-General has disclosed a holding. Has the Attorney-General disclosed this underlying holding to the Prime Minister under Clause 3.12 of the Ministerial Code, which requires an immediate notification where an investment in a company might give rise to a perception of a conflict of interest?
I give the call to the Attorney-General.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bradfield for his question. I have complied with the Ministerial Code of Conduct at all times.
Order. I give the call to the member for Moreton.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for International Development and the Pacific. How are the Albanese Labor government's Pacific sporting programs improving Australia's Pacific relationships and supporting Pacific aspirations?
Give the call to the Minister for Defence Industry and International Development and the Pacific.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Moreton for his excellent question. There is no greater champion of sport in this place than the member for Moreton. If there's a parliamentary sport to be played, he is there. Mr Speaker, sport brings the Pacific together. It's symbolic of our shared values, our history and our people-to-people connections. Now, Mr Speaker, some people in this House might have thought the most important sporting event of the weekend was in Melbourne on Saturday night. But sadly they are wrong. They are wrong. The most important sporting event was the Prime Minister's 13 games in Brisbane last night between Australia and the PNG women's and men's teams. It was a great night. We had Prime Ministers Albanese and Marape there. We had 6 PNG ministers, Minister Wells and myself, and the Leader of the Opposition was there, and I thank him for his presence, demonstrating the bipartisan commitment to the Pacific in this place. Prior to that game, Mr Speaker, I had the privilege of announcing $2.3 million in funding to support the Papua New Guinea Rugby League high performance strategy. This is all about growing and empowering rugby league in the Pacific and Papua New Guinea in particular. It's all about generating the next Justin Olam and the next Elsie Albert to bring them on into the rugby league competition. And, Mr Speaker, this is an example of the broader support for Pacific sports that's within this government, started by the Keating government in 1994 and now continued under the $15 million per annum Pacific Oz Sports program. This supports the most popular team sports in the Pacific: netball, rugby league, rugby union and football, through 6 nations including PNG, Fiji, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Samoa and Tonga. And it's all about using sport to improve the lives of people in the Pacific, develop communities and especially empower women and girls. And sports brings the Pacific family together. You just have to watch the joy of the Fijiana Drua team when they won the Super Women's Pacific Rugby Cup. It was evident last night when, I'm sad to say, 95% of the crowd was going for Papua New Guinea. And it'll be evident on Sunday night coming up, where we see Penrith play Parramatta in the NRL Grand Final, where 50% of NRL players are Pacifica origin. That's great for our country and it's great for the region. Mr Speaker, sports cooperation and sports diplomacy brings the Pacific together. It's a critical part of Australia's engagement with the Pacific. It's a critical advantage we have in remaining the partner of choice for the Pacific family, and it was great to see Prime Minister Marape and Albanese there last night celebrating Pacific sports together.
On indulgence, the Leader of the Opposition.
Well, just quickly on indulgence, Mr Speaker, I want to thank the Minister for his answer and thank him for the recognition of what was a very significant event last night. And obviously he's a Sydney Swans supporter, which is why he was happy to move on from the other event on the weekend, or for some reason he didn't like that game. But last night was a celebration of the friendship between our two countries, and there is no more important period in history where our two countries need to come together. And James Marape is a particularly dear friend of our country. Brian Kramer and other ministers were there last night, and we've worked very closely with all of them over a long period of time. And the fact that our Prime Minister has extended an opportunity for Prime Minister Marape to travel with him to Tokyo for Mr Abe's funeral is to be recognised as well. The depth of the friendship is necessary, and through sport, as the Minister points out, it is a common language, and it's an opportunity for us to develop and to grow even further the relationship between our two countries. And it was a great night. It was a little one-sided by about 70-4, I think, in the results in each of the games, but nonetheless a celebration of a great friendship.
Give the call to the member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Since its election, this government has failed to take any practical action to address rising costs of living, and over the next few weeks, Tasmanian families will see a 25-cent per litre jump in fuel prices. Does the Treasurer expect my constituents to wait until he delivers his budget in a month for any sign of additional relief, or will this government do its job and produce a plan for addressing this cost of living crisis?
The call to the Treasurer.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I say respectfully to the member for Bass that if those opposite didn't want the fuel excise relief to end on Wednesday night, why did they legislate that before the government changed hands? And so,
order. Members on my left.
I mean, I find it very concerning that those opposite are either being dishonest about that, or they don't understand that that's the legislation that they put into this parliament, that the fuel excise relief will stop on Wednesday night of this week. And we've been very upfront with people before the election, during the election, after the election, that when you inherit a budget which is heaving with $1 trillion in Liberal Party debt from those opposites, spraying money around to their mates, giving money out to everyone who comes through the door, then that necessitates some difficult decisions on this side of the House. And we could do what those opposite have done and pretend away these fiscal pressures which are damaging the budget and making it harder for us to provide cost of living relief to Australians right around the country, and we're not prepared to do that. So we've been upfront about the future of the fuel excise relief. It will come off on Wednesday night for all of the reasons that we've been saying ever since before the election. It's consistent with the legislation that those opposite proposed and passed through this House. And so I think when people hear those opposite playing politics with that petrol excise relief, they understand that it's those opposite who legislated it to finish on Wednesday night. Now, when it comes to the broader cost of living, Mr Speaker, you'd think after a decade of deliberate wage stagnation and deliberate wage suppression, that those opposites would be too ashamed of themselves to come in here and talk about the cost of living. Now, if it hadn't been for a government that said that a deliberate design feature of their economic policy was to keep wages low, then Australians would find it easier to deal with these costs of living which are skyrocketing as a consequence of some international factors as well as some domestic factors as well. And so what we've said since the election, before the election, during the election campaign itself, is that we will provide responsible cost of living relief. We'll make childcare cheaper, we'll make medicines cheaper, we'll make TAFE fees cheaper, and we'll get wages moving again after that wasted decade of deliberate wage stagnation and wage suppression. And the difference between this side of the House is that we will always do what's right for working people in this country who are dealing with these cost of living pressures. Those opposite spent a decade making people's lives harder by going after their wages and working conditions.
Give the call to the member for Hasluck.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veteran Affairs. How is the Albanese Labor government responding to the interim report from the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide?
Give the call to the Minister for Veterans Affairs and Minister for Defence Personnel.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Hasluck for her very important question and for her service as part of Unit 109 Signals Army Reserve as well. When a person enlists in the ADF, they are signing up to serve their country, to serve the people of Australia. But the rate of veteran suicide in Australia is a national tragedy. It is a rate that is significantly higher than across the general Australian population. Indeed, Australia has lost more serving and former serving personnel to suicide over the last 20 years than it did over the same period in operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. That is why the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide needed to happen. And this government called for that Royal Commission when we were in opposition. It's why, when the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide provided its interim report to the government on 11 August, this government saw that it was tabled in Parliament and made public that same day. That day, on behalf of the government, I welcomed the report and provided the government's initial response. Today, I followed through on our commitment then to formally respond to the report as soon as possible, today presenting our formal response. We have a lot of work to do, but we are a responsible government that will take action. We're doing that from today, and the interim report's 13 recommendations fall into 3 key themes: improving claims processing, administration of the Royal Commission and access to information by loved ones. The government has already implemented one of those recommendations. We have agreed to 9, we've agreed in principle to 1, and we have noted 2 others. We have agreed to develop a pathway to simplify and harmonise veterans' compensation and rehabilitation legislation. We'll work to eliminate the claims backlog, improve the veterans' experience of the administration of the claims system, and we're liaising with the Department of Veterans Affairs on their funding needs on a regular basis. And we have removed the Department of Veterans Affairs average staffing cap. We agree in principle to work to increase the protections for people who engage with the Royal Commission. We've noted the importance of access to information whilst protecting the freedom of speech in this parliament and the need for the Royal Commissioners to have access to the information they need, and will improve policies and practices around public interest immunity. We have also agreed to recommendations 9 through 13 to improve the release of information from Defence and DVA to family about a deceased family member. A lot of work is already underway, but we are under no illusion. There is a lot of work more to do. The Royal Commission and the government's response is also an opportunity to shine a light on the supports that are available, and we will continue to improve promotion of them into all corners of the defence, families, veterans and their families' community. Our government is committed to the task of saving lives and ensuring a better future for our defence and veteran communities.
The call to the member for New England.
Just on indulgence, Mr. Speaker, I concur with my remarks. On an observation of the interim report and listening to the ministerial statement, you can see no great gulf between our 2 positions. Our endeavours are absolutely focused on making sure we deal with the tragedy of veteran suicide. It's a travesty that one of the safer places you can be in regards to suicide is in full-time service or in the reserves. But one of the most afflicted groups, especially ex-service women, on their way out of the services, one of the highest suicide rates, and for those who, by reason of medical discharge, have gone out of the services. So we want to make sure that Civvy Street is as safe as what it would be in the barracks, and we are very proud on this side of having brought about the Royal Commission. And once more, I'd commend the efforts of the member for Wide Bay, the member for Braddon, the member for Herbert, the member for Canning, on their efforts to bring about the Royal Commission. And we note that on this issue, because those who have served our nation, and especially those who have paid the supreme sacrifice, deserve no less from us than our greatest endeavours to make sure that people are safe and those who have served our nations are treated with respect and live a fulsome life that is a warrant to them and to the honour of their families who have given so much for the protection of our land.
Call the Acting Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Call the Leader of the House.
Speaker, documents are tabled in accordance with the list circulated to honourable members today. Full details of the documents will be recorded in the votes and proceedings.